Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar co-hosted by the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy's Innovation Policy Lab and the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. I'm Spriya Dwivedi, up until recently, former host of the morning show on Global News Radio 640 Toronto. Today, we're going to be talking about urban leadership and innovation during times of crisis. We are inviting questions from the audience. There's a little Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will be trying to get to as many of those as possible. So, keep them coming as they sort of pop into your head. Our panelists today, Carol Saab, CEO, Federation of Canadian Municipalities; Richard Florida, university professor at University of Toronto School of Cities and Rotman School of Management, a distinguished fellow at NYU and FIU, and co-founder and senior editor of the Atlantic City Lab. Anita McGann joins us as well, university professor and Georgie Connell Chair in Organizations and Society, Rotman School of Management, and Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Shauna Braille, associate professor, Institute for Management and Innovation, University of Toronto, Mississauga, and senior associate, Innovation Policy Lab, Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Now that we've got the introductions out of the way, let's get started. Carol, I'll start with you. There's a lot of municipalities that are right now in the midst of struggling a tad, I suppose, with their provincial counterparts, and they seem to be kind of jumping the provincial step in talks and going straight up to the feds. Do you think you're going to see an increase in municipalities and cities basically going directly to the feds on a lot of issues, or is this just sort of a blip because we are, of course, in the middle of all of this?
Thanks very much, Priya, for the question, and thank you to the organizers for bringing this great panel together. I'll just start very briefly by saying I'm coming to you from Ottawa, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. To your question, Supriya, I think really what we're seeing right now are the full-blown symptoms of a outdated system and a broken framework in which cities are really doing everything possible and being as creative as possible to drive progress for their cities and to serve their citizens in what is an increasingly complex and difficult time, really without the tools and powers to be able to do that as effectively as one would like. We're dealing with a framework that was set up long before the modern city could have been imagined, before really the calls on cities and the role that they play in driving this country forward and the economy forward could have been imagined, the role that they play in really pushing forward supports and social supports, driving an equity agenda could have been imagined. And I think we're seeing that play out, and that has resulted in a number of different things happening, including some creative solutions that cities have been able to drive and municipalities have been able to drive. And I think really what it points to is the need to modernize and the need to have a real conversation as a country about how we're going to treat cities going forward, what is the proper role for a city in our modern reality, and how are we going to leverage some world-class cities to the benefit of Canadians and the Canadian economy going forward. Every time this conversation comes up, a very quick and fast red herring of the Constitution gets thrown in there, but I want to be really clear that there really is nothing unconstitutional, first and foremost, about talking to each other across governments. There is nothing unconstitutional about exploring real direct partnerships. We've proven that it's successful, that we can deliver outcomes quickly and efficiently when we do that. And there's certainly nothing unconstitutional about having a conversation about, in this day and age, what do Canadians need from governments and how they work together to be able to deliver the best kinds of outcomes. And I think that's a really important shift that we need to make now. Really has to be the time for this conversation. We stand at the precipice of a moment of significant challenges, but also significant potential for a real transformation. And you hear a lot of talk, and we're going to get into it as well, I suspect, on this panel about how do we want to build out of this? Yes. What's the recovery that we want? Needs to be greener. It needs to be more equitable. Yes, to all of those things. How are we going to drive that if we're not really critically looking at the role of cities in that context? And so there have been a number of good examples. Most recently, the Rapid Housing Initiative, where cities worked and through SCM really quite directly with the federal government to shape a program that is going to be able to move quick, that is going to be as targeted as it needs to be based on need to house Canadians who are currently experiencing homelessness at a very dangerous time for them amid a global pandemic. And that's the kind of thinking that we need to scale, not only again in housing in a bigger, more ambitious way, but certainly across the board on other key city issues.
That actually leads me quite nicely into my next question for Richard, because Richard, I was going to ask you first up. I mean, how can the different levels of government really work together and in concert to put forward an inclusive and an equitable, post-COVID recovery? Like, how, there's been a lot of talk, to Carol's point, but how do you actually put something into action moving forward?
Well, thank you for that. And first off, I think right now, even though we're in the depth of this and things look tough, I mean, the fact that we have now created a vaccine that looks like it will be implemented, multiple vaccines, inside of a year of a once in a century pandemic is pretty remarkable. So, we flog ourselves about this all the time, but certainly by summer, with any luck, even early, we could be in a very different situation. And I think we just got to keep our eye on that and remain steadfast to get through these very difficult next month and a half, 2-3 months. Look, I think Canada has done a pretty darn good job at managing this pandemic. Our system, which is provincially run, has performed well. I'm an American, so is Ania. We're adopted Canadians. It was painful to see the American system not work so well. And Canadian government is divided. There is a very liberal prime minister in Ontario, where we live and exist, a pretty conservative premier, and a mayor who is center right. So it's not like everyone was on the same page politically or ideologically, but they pulled together. Jan De Silva and I at the Board of Trade wrote a piece a while back on this at Jan and the board's urging that said, look, and it echoed what Carol and the Federation of Mayors have been saying, and the New Urban Agenda that Sean has been part of with us, the Urban Project. We've got to get more power to the cities. And, in many cases, our large cities are bigger than many provinces. They're hamstrung by a lack of power. Funny story for all of you. In the middle of this darn pandemic, somehow I got on a call with a bunch of generals. I've never done this before. This is what a bunch of American generals I get on a call with. And I said, we have to decentralize decision-making and move it down to the local level and empower cities. And the generals, these are 4- and 3-star generals, said to me, the American military, that's exactly what we did. We realized that we no longer needed command and control. We needed to empower the commanders and the troops and the brigades where they are. Well, if the American military can learn that darn lesson, we can too. And I think we have a great moment. The one other thing I would say, but Jan and I pointed out in that opinion piece, is that it shouldn't be something which is just handing over power to cities per se. Cities are part of bigger regional metropolitan areas, like the GTA, to use an example close to home. And we should encourage communities and cities to develop strategies and to work not only as independent actors with more power, but regionally. And a good example of that, what's happening in the United Kingdom as we speak, is actually decentralizing, devolving power from the federal government, their national government, to metropolitan coalitions and co-organizations of mayors.
Good answer. Anita, I was going to ask you firstly, with respect to the changes that you expect to see within the business sector as well as within our social systems, how do you think cities and municipalities will end up responding to those changes as a result, we'll inevitably see because of this pandemic?
Sure thing. Well, thank you again, and thanks to the organizers. And I just wanted to follow Carol by saying that I'm calling in from Massachusetts, which is the traditional land of the Wampanoag, the Nauset, the Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I agree with Richard that leadership in Canada during the pandemic has been really pretty effective in Canada. Of course, there have been gaps, but overall, there has been a coming together that's inspiring. I would say that the other side of that coin is that the door is now open on old changes that were upon us before the pandemic that we can no longer resist. So my top list of the business challenges that are going to affect cities across Canada and across the world even, but especially in Canada, are in real estate in the first place. And of course, that ripples through to construction and finance and so on. You know, this is the largest industry in Canada. Real estate is the largest source of wealth in Canada. And there's going to be a profound impact on the way that physical space within our cities is used. And that is a business issue. It's also a public sector issue. It's an issue that's going to be pervasive across sectors. The second is retail, which of course had been under this unbelievable pressure previously. We've already seen the shuttering of a lot of old shops and the movement towards services. I think even the movement towards services now is going to be challenged. A lot of issues around that. And then the third is that the automobile sector is going to be profoundly affected by the pandemic in ways, again, that had been accumulating even before the pandemic. It's interesting, 6 out of 10 of the top 10 industries in Canada, 6 out of 10 of the top 10 are all related to the auto industry. Canada is an auto-centered country, both in terms of our manufacturing sector and the way we live. And I think there will be, of course, profound changes as a result of the pandemic there. In the social sector, I'll just briefly run through this. Healthcare is going to be profoundly changed. Again, a very large economic sector as well. Education, we're going to have some profound challenges associated with homelessness and welfare, especially as we get into the winter months. And then the arts is of great concern to me as well. So lots there to unpack, and I'm thrilled to be part of a conversation to do that.
Shauna, my first question to you has to do with something that I think Richard and Anita had both sort of touched on with respect to the, compare and contrast with us and the Americans, and that is trust in public institutions. And generally, places that do not have high trust in their public institutions haven't fared so well in the pandemic. Are you at all, I suppose, worried about the potential negative impacts the pandemic may have with respect to our own relationship and our own trust with respect to our institutions?
Thank you, Supriya. I guess the first thing I would say is I'm worried about a lot of things. There is no shortage of things to be worried about right now. We have 64 million cases worldwide of confirmed coronavirus, almost at 1.5 million deaths. And in Canada, we're close to 400,000 cases and more than 12,000 deaths. Toronto, just yesterday, 434 cases and 17 new deaths. And we know that our ICUs and hospitals are starting to fill up. And so that's a really grave concern. And I think, in all of these conversations, we have to place first and foremost the very sort of devastating health impacts of the pandemic. And then how we are addressing them. And so in terms of our institutions and in terms of thinking about how do we build and generate trust, I agree with Richard and Anita, and I salute Carol for all of the work that the FCM has done and continues to do in terms of making an effort to bring leaders together to have conversations, to develop a set of tools, to advocate for new powers, new funds, and also to work with communities to get a much stronger sense of where the greatest challenges lie, both in terms of health, in terms of our economy, in terms of how we address climate crisis and an equity crisis as well. So really hugely challenging. I think in the Canadian context, we've seen mayors of Canada's big cities and mayors of really all of Canada's cities come to the table to initiate relatively rapid responses, both from the health side, from the also, on on the pandemic, but also public health more broadly, whether that relates to addressing homelessness, whether that relates to addressing transit services for frontline workers who continue to need to move about in their regions and who rely on public services. And we've also seen other sort of shifts and adjustments. But we also, I was walking my dog down the street the other day, and I was really surprised that on one of our neighbors' lawns a few blocks away was a sign saying, no more lockdown, showing people in prison. Nobody in Canada living in a home is in a prison right now.
Yeah.
And I think that really just goes to underscore the divisiveness that we see in response to how we can best address the challenge and the crisis. And I think we know in many cities, including in Toronto, we have regular rallies with people with very different perspectives, whether that has to do with masks or something else. How we move through this crisis and out of it will have a very significant impact on how we come together, as a city, but also as a country. And we need to find ways to do that both with integrity, but also that continues to build support and trust and honesty within our, within the places where we live.
Anita, did you want to get in there? It looked like you were trying to.
I was agreeing. I'm especially worried about sustaining public trust during the access to vaccines conversation. If we have to wait a year, where other countries, including the United States, have to wait 2 weeks, that may have an impact on public trust.
Carol, I wanted to ask you something that you had sort of touched on in the beginning, but there has been, I think, basically an undeniable exacerbation of inequalities, and cities, and especially large cities, are almost the best, and I'm putting that in air quotes, place to see it in action. Going forward, how do we go about building an inclusive economy, but one that also takes into account the realities of climate change? Just to give one example, Shauna was touching on everything that she's worried about. I mean, one thing that I'm certainly worried about with climate change and with the increase of stagnant water and flooding is the increase of mosquito-borne illnesses and diseases. So that's something we also have to, take into account, but that may not be front of mind. And it's I know that's like a big picture question, but there's just so much there that I think, you can provide in terms of answers for our audience on that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I'd say there's absolutely no doubt that the pandemic has had a real disproportionate impact on racialized Canadians, on women, and exacerbated the inequities that existed before, right? And same goes for climate change in terms of its disproportionate impact on those communities as well. And so, I mean, I think there's two ways, and maybe I'll take it in that order to address your question here. And one is to think about how these challenges intersect, the inequity and climate change. And they do in almost all the ways. And the second is the tools that cities have to address them. And so the first, I think, starts with really actively recognizing and internalizing in the policy development responses that we generate as a country that the impacts of climate change are felt most severely by our most vulnerable, and that tackling climate change is an imperative for inclusive communities. These things go hand in hand, and we've really got to approach the solutions as holistically as that. The other way is really to look at the services that municipalities deliver and their ability to answer both those questions through targeted programs, including things like transit investments, including through energy retrofits and so forth. I'll give you a very concrete example that FCM has got a hand in, which is our Green Municipal Fund, and that it's doing work in really targeted priority areas to drive GHG reductions, but also are going to really enhance and build towards more inclusive communities. And this is the kind of work that looks like deep energy retrofits and clean energy generation for pillars like rec centers and community centers that are key to building inclusive communities, improving the environmental performance of new and existing social and affordable housing units, which in part is incenting the creation of supply as well. And again, adding more supply into the affordable housing market. building active transportation pathways, bridges, multimodal interventions, ensuring that we're deploying zero emission vehicles in core municipal and community functions. All of these kinds of things have a real impact if we're deliberate about it towards enhancing inclusivity going forward. And then I would just say, really, there is no way to consider how we emerge with a more inclusive society without dealing very urgently with affordable housing and homelessness. And I've highlighted some of the ways that climate intersects against that. But there is a really significant, both again, challenge and opportunity right now to take really significant strides as a country, really in some ways being pushed into it by the pandemic, to really fundamentally change the game and how the sectors, how governments coordinate around this, to take a real significant push forward towards ending homelessness and really building affordable housing, which is going to be a staple of people's ability to engage community, to engage the economy going forward.
Richard, you're nodding your head quite vigorously there. Is there anything that you wanted to add in before I get in with my own question to you?
Two questions, two comments. One, I think we have to make inclusivity just a priority in everything we do. And I think communities in Canada around the world have really not addressed recovery strategies. They've been talked about, but I really think that building out recovery strategies really matters. And inclusivity need to be at the center of those, because what we've seen with COVID-19 is it reinforces every divide we have in our world. Gender, race, socioeconomic class, they're just getting geographic, they're just getting worse. They're not getting better. And, we can be an armchair historian and look back at the last major pandemic, the Spanish flu in 1918. And what followed that was the Roaring '20s, the era of the most heinous inequality that in modern memory. And so I just think that the second point that I want to make is regarding Shauna and lockdown. Look, I think we've used a pretty blunt tool, and I think we have to be smart about this. What shocked me is not the sign you saw, Shauna, but the fact that some of the most progressive mayors in America, London Breed, former mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, were hosting parties in the Napa Valley at the French Laundry restaurant at the same time that they were saying to their constituencies, well, stay inside. People get lockdown fatigue. And I think one of the things that we need to do is have a very serious postmortem and develop strategies about how economic development, community development, public health authorities can work together to develop perhaps better strategies that people can deal with lockdown, quarantine, because this hasn't worked. It's worked better in Canada than it has in other places. But to be honest, it hasn't worked all that great.
Let me follow up on that just really quickly, because I find that interesting. With respect to, lockdowns in North America versus in many other jurisdictions, whether it's Asia or Europe, would you consider what we are going through right now in, let's say, Toronto proper or the GTA more generally as a lockdown? Because it's not really compared to what Italy went through or what, very many other parts of the world went through.
No, but people still did at that. And so I think there is a growing recognition that there are measures that can be taken, reduced quarantine, more strategic quarantine, better use of testing. I think we learned a big lesson with schools, a very good lesson with schools. Things that we can and should close, like bars and restaurants, where the virus is much more efficiently propagated. But I think, look, this is not going to be our first go round at this. And you mentioned, Supriya, mosquito-borne illnesses.
I've been prepping for a pandemic since my first intro to microbiology class. So yeah.
And took others of us like my surprise. But I do think we should be thinking about these kind of measures, and measures that are not only effective in the public health terms and work in countries like Asia, in parts of Asia, but measures that work in a democracy. And I don't want to applaud by any means. I'm not needing to applaud the Swedish strategy. Please don't anyone listening don't think it. But what they tried to do in Sweden was come up with a set of measures that could be plausibly accepted for the long term by their people. I'm not saying they got it right, but we should be learning from that. What are the kinds of intervention measures that we can live with, and that won't lead to what Shauna saw on her block? Let me out of lockdown now. I don't like this.
Yeah, or like the barbecue guy. Anita, you wanted to get in there?
The barbecue guy, perfect example.
Yeah, I just have been working on a project on this, and I couldn't agree more. It's a project in which we look at different types of policies and whether or not they're effective. And just stepping up to 30,000 feet, kind of the main finding, and this is a Bayesian serum model in which we use data from the Oxford database and calibrate for excess deaths and project into the future. What we basically, the big picture finding is that we need compliance in ways that are not mechanical. We need people to make good decisions in each moment. And when they can't make good decisions, whether it's because of fatigue or for some other reason, such as economic duress or bad judgment or something, we have to have rapid systems that are designed to rapidly identify propagation of the disease and to contain it in order to avoid what is economically painful, and which is what Shauna's neighbor was concerned about, which is partial or full workplace closings and restrictions on gatherings, which aren't really lockdowns, of course, because we still have our civil liberties and so on. But being told that you can't open a workplace is of great economic consequence to many people. Those workplace policies, by the way, had better work if we do have to resort to them, because then we have to go to school closings. And if we go to school closings, we're really, that has very long-term consequences for our society as a whole and for young people in general. So just an endorsement of what Richard was saying about creativity. I want to. There's a lot to say about what that could look like, but I don't want to take the podium here.
No, not at all. Shauna, I wanted to ask you, because this kind of leads in quite nicely. We're kind of talking as a whole a little bit about evidence-based decision making, and of course, politicians always will throw that around. We need to, listen to the evidence, focus on the evidence, yada yada. How do we actually, incorporate some of the data and some of the evidence that we do have into that decision making? Because we know, to be frank and to be blunt, city councils and municipal leaders don't always do that. So how do we go about convincing decision makers that it shouldn't just be like some sort of weird campaign slogan-y type thing, but something that they're actually doing?
Well, that is a great question. The answer, I think, is really twofold, because one, there's the sort of the idea that we need more data, we need to build up the evidence base, just like the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated all of the inequalities that we see in our cities. It's also really highlighted a number of data gaps, both in terms of the collection of data and in terms of the public sharing of that data. So some of these gaps have been remedied relatively quickly. If we think about all of the public health dashboards that share really crucial information, and if most big cities, like I know Toronto has an excellent dashboard on the public health transmission and incidence of COVID. It has information on where cases and where transmission is occurring. After realizing and recognizing and acknowledging the great disparities, particularly in racialized and low-income neighborhoods, they agreed to both collect and share on a limited basis some of that intra-urban geography of the transmission, which has been so helpful in ensuring that policymakers understand that it is actually in the corners of the city that are least well served by transit, that are most frequently characterized by more crowded living environments, by racialized populations, by households living in lower incomes, often greater proportion of newcomers, that actually we need to figure out how to target services specifically to the populations that are suffering the most, because there are many neighborhoods in the city where the transmission and the incidence of both COVID and loss of work, or require, the need to take public transit to get to work, is actually very low to zero in some cases. And so having this data really helps us to understand where to prioritize and where to invest. And so that data is one piece of it, right? Mm-hmm. We're not totally there yet. There are a lot of things we could use more and better data on, and that's in some cases being collected. But the other piece of that is political. right? It's around, it goes back to your question about trust. It goes back to building relationships and collaboration. It's around building goodwill and support, and a lot of both, in front of the scenes work, but a lot of behind the scenes work to build on those relationships, and to come to agreement, which doesn't always happen in the public domain. The other thing I wanted to mention, back to our previous part of the conversation, but really connects on the data piece, but also around the supports, is that I've been doing some work on a project called Toronto After the First Wave. And we've been looking at data and evidence from the city that shows how Toronto is managing in terms of what is the public health implications following the first wave of the virus. So we started this work in September and October of this year. We've looked at some urban development indicators. Most recently, we looked at economic vibrancy, and we also did a scrape of Yelp, thanks to a very talented group of students that I'm working with, looking at restaurant openings and closures. And so one of the things we found, and the data we have is from May 2020 to November 2020, so we're missing the very first piece, but what we found is actually there were more restaurant openings than closures during that time, which indicates entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity. It doesn't tell us, though, who's losing their job, who has fewer hours of work. But what it does tell us in some ways, that some of these government funding programs, and perhaps some of the public realm and public space programs, are having an impact. And if I look at our most recent dashboard, where we have some information on business disruptions, we have some data that shows that bankruptcies are down. So some of these income supports really are working, and we need them. But new business licenses are down even more than bankruptcies. So we have a very long tail of disruption here, and impacts that are going to take a long time to understand. The supports are helping, and those supports are going to be needed for quite some time.
Interesting. Carol, I'm going to address this to you, but anybody feel free to sort of jump in once Carol's done her answer. But there were a lot of predictions at the beginning of the pandemic that what you were going to start seeing was this huge flight from cities to, more rural or even just exurban areas, I suppose, because nobody wanted to live in cities anymore. And this was just going to be the death of that. Do you think there's any credibility to that claim? And does it sort of bear out in terms of what we're seeing in so far with respect to the pandemic?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think cities and city life are facing their end. No, rather, I think we're seeing people wanting to really more consciously curate relationships to these places where we live, where we work, where we raise our families. I think also what people are living and learning in real time is in this sort of massive shift to virtual work. And again, there's a lot in there around privilege and equity that needs to be explored. So I'll say that as a significant caveat. But really, for those who are in a situation that they were able to shift their work virtually, it expands the possibilities of living everywhere. And so I think we're seeing folks who are able to take advantage of that, do that, seeking some space, seeking access to nature and so forth. I think fundamentally, pandemic restrictions have showcased what really matters for folks. I think we've all been doing a lot of soul searching on that in our various ways. I think, connections to your family, to your friends, to community, all of that is taking on a heightened importance, or we're exposing ourselves to how much of that we truly need in our lives. And for many, I think that includes a connection to your city, to your community. And I think many are going to be driven to think about, and I hope, maybe this is rose-colored lenses driven by hope and optimism, but I really do think that many are going to be more driven to think about how our cities work and grow and evolve. And folks, when you're in one place and really starting to think about how much of your life is changed by the limits of your access to your city, and how your experience of it has fundamentally changed, I think it drives a different level of awareness. And so I hope that what that translates into is a real drive, some real innovation around how we think about cities and our spaces. And I think, we haven't yet seen shifts that are potentially permanent. Obviously, as almost everyone has pointed out, this has been a game changer on almost every front. But I think even the minor shifts that we are seeing at a city level raise really good questions about how we plan our cities, including the types of housing and transit we look to build. And I think those are learnings that we have to really try to sort through. Shauna, I'm so interested in that project you were just describing. I'm going to check it out. But I think we do need to really be doing that kind of postmortem, that kind of research, collecting that kind of data to inform how we do this work going forward. And, you know, I think prior to the pandemic, we looked to city centers as the primary hub, you know, and we you know, built the housing and transit to serve that. And I think even if some Canadians decide they want to live closer to more residential communities, we may see some different approaches to the mobility and housing options that are available across municipalities, and more transit oriented communities, you know, more nodes and more building accordingly. And so I think this changes potentially what city life looks like. I think this changes what planning for cities looks like, but I really don't think it means the end of either.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. I think there's very little evidence to suggest there is an end to cities. Anyone who's looked at the mobility data will come to the conclusion that it's mainly families with children that have moved out of mainly US cities. And those are family formation moves. I always say my parents moved out of Newark, New Jersey in 1960 when I was 2 and my brother was an infant, to a nearby suburb in North Arlington. One thing that's different is that remote work technology enables you to move a little further. So instead of moving to the adjacent suburb, you can go to College Country or you can go to Kelowna, you know, so it enables you to move further than you would have. I think the big implication for cities is not the geography of residence. And in fact, I see very little of that shift in Canada, in Toronto. I think it's the geography of work. I think we are going to see, here's the way I'd phrase it. In urban affairs, we use the term central business district. That means that area of the center city, which is filled with giant office towers, where these office workers stream in on GO trains and subways and cars. This is going to take a huge hit. And I don't think anyone is thinking seriously enough about how big a hit. That it is a waste of resources. It's a commuting nightmare. It's a waste of energy. It takes a huge psychic toll, and people are just not going to do it. I mean, I have friends who would say, you know, I love going to the office. I was like, yeah, I'll go once or twice a week, but I'm not going all the time anymore. I'm going to work from home. I'm going to work remotely. I'm going to work the way I want. I think there's a big opportunity there to remake those one-dimensional neighborhoods that, by the way, Jane Jacobs, they provoked her hire, to remake them as actual 24/7 integrated neighborhoods. And this construct that urbanists use, it's an old construct with a new name, the 15-minute neighborhood. That's what we should be striving for, so that across our cities, in office districts, in residential neighborhoods, we bring more work. But most importantly, going back to something everyone has said, what's happening in Canada now is the people who can, and there's a great research project going on this, the people who can access, the Globe and Mail actually summarized a lot of this data, who get to live in 15-minute neighborhoods are the affluent and the advantaged. The people who don't get to live in 15-minute neighborhoods are the less advantaged, where they have to not only commute a long way to work, they have to commute a long way to the doctor. They have to commute a long way to get groceries and get basic necessities. They can't afford to get stuff delivered. So I think this idea of the 15-minute neighborhood is a good one, but that's another area where unless we put a real focus on inclusivity, we're going to have two different worlds, a world of 15-minute neighborhoods for the affluent and the advantaged, and a world of very difficult neighborhoods for the rest.
I wanted to pivot to some audience questions now, because we are getting quite a few of them, and thank you for them. This is for, I guess, anyone who wants to answer it. There's no doubt that we need innovation on all fronts, social, biz, et cetera, including innovating adoption of new technologies such as AI, Internet of Things, et cetera. What are some of the challenges in the greater and faster adoption of these? Yeah, Anita, go ahead.
Yeah, so what a great question, and thank you for that. You know, I think AI is an overlay on the points that my colleagues have been making about this tension between inclusivity and innovation. So this AI can make all these problems that Richard was just referring to, that Carol's been discussing, that Shauna described regarding trust, can make them all much worse, or it can make them all much better. And we're going to have to really, I think, create some deep capabilities in cities, in public governance, to be able to use data better, to make sure that the regulatory sort of wrap around AI is enforced, that the people that are not left out of the opportunities associated with AI and everything it enables are not relegated to jobs and functions within society that are unsafe, that are climate exposed, that are going to deepen their problems and the inequalities that they face. We have to make sure that AI and all of the potential value that it could unleash doesn't amp up the efficiency of old systems that were discriminatory and left a lot of people out of the game. So getting that right requires expertise in AI and AI governance, data governance in cities that we haven't yet really quite fully, engaged or understood or certainly pursued.
Carol, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I completely agree with that, and I was gonna sort of pull a bit back out of from AI specifically and more around the sort of intersection of innovation and equity. And I really think we, and it's to Richard's point as well, we've got to first start with a look at who is defining prosperity, and then how it is that we're building towards that. And so, we are in all of these kinds of conversations, of which I've been a part of many, in terms of how is it that we look at urban planning differently? How are we going to build cities that look differently? I think, fundamental to it is making sure that the people who are driving that conversation are representative of the people who are living in cities, and that it's really and are starting with a fundamental premise of how are we defining prosperity, and is it being defined by people equally? And I think until, with all of our efforts to do this work, absent a real hard look at bringing in the kinds of voices that have lived experience, wanting to make sure that we're ground truthing theories and data in people's really lived experience, I think is critical. And that all starts with a better, more informed definition of prosperity.
And I want to talk about one other thing that we haven't mentioned. And that's about our long-run competitiveness, productivity, innovation, living standards, and jobs. It's pretty clear that in an innovation economy, the source of wealth comes from the clustering of people, talent, knowledge in cities or metropolitan areas. It's pretty clear. It's no longer how big your factories are, how deep your oil wells are. It's pretty clear that that's where the source of the competitive advantage comes from. Canada better get with that. And we had better think a lot about that alongside our conversation about distribution, which is critical because it's been horrific. We better have a very serious introspect about our competitiveness and productivity and technology and innovation. We applaud ourselves in Toronto and say we've achieved a lot as a tech hub, but Toronto still not. It's a long way to go. And Vancouver, a longer way to go. And Montreal, still a longer way to go to become a first-class leading edge tech hub. But as I say that, we are looking at probably the greatest opportunity space in the amount of time I've known Canada well. The US has imposed heinous immigration restrictions on the world, and the Trump administration has poisoned the well for talent. Toronto and Canada have remained open. We have invested in the kind of basic infrastructure of transit that we need. And I think we need to put our eyes on this ball now before that there's a new administration in Washington. It's going to be very different than what came before it. US cities are very big and very powerful, and they're very close to Canadian cities. I just think it's time to really think long and hard about how we bolster, of course, the shared prosperity and inclusion, 100%, but how we bolster the economic competitiveness of our cities, because my fear is that we might miss this moment. Nita made very good points about real estate. We could say the same thing about finance. We can say the same thing about artificial intelligence. We need to really work on harnessing and really enhancing those assets in our big cities.
That's a good point. With respect to it, and this is, Shauna, I'll start with you, but anyone can sort of jump in after the fact. With respect to the conversations, we're having about allowing cities to have some more powers, and whether that's taxation or whether that's general authority, we've had those conversations for a very long time. COVID has obviously led to more of them, but why should any of us really believe, I suppose, that we're actually going to get to the point where the talk kind of turns into action? Yeah,
Well, I think,
that was an
you
audience
know,
question, by the way, so thank you for that. Yeah.
well, thank you, audience. That's an excellent and hard question. Um, I think though that we need to be hopeful, and we need to have hope. And some of the history, at least the most recent history around very rapid responses, emphasis on being, on attempts to be supportive economically while at the same time managing a huge public health crisis. A greater focus, I think, on things like kindness and compassion, but also, again, just the rapid introduction and rollout and implementation of a number of initiatives, whether they're at the municipal, provincial, or federal level. And particularly because we're talking about our cities, we see our cities making some really quick changes now within the limits that they're permitted to do. Things around public realm, around adding bike lanes, or around using sidewalks and streets for purposes other than one person in a big giant car taking up all the space. So we're starting to see some of those changes. We're starting to see cities work collaboratively with other levels of government on homelessness challenges, on creating more affordable housing, on those kinds of rollouts too. And and what we haven't seen yet, but hopefully it's coming, are more changes around how cities work with the provinces, or around how the federal government can help to flow more funds to cities, like the Rapid Housing Initiative. But whether we're thinking about, is it raising new kinds of taxes, like through road tolls or through a vacant homes tax? Is it figuring out, how to work more effectively with provincial governments? And cities, as the creatures of the provinces, are always and regularly challenged by provincial mandates around what's best for the city versus how do we manage within the province. And we also have the regional level as well. But we are starting, as a result of this crisis, to see more and different kinds of collaboration and institution building that I think will lead to new, creativity, innovation, new ideas, hopefully more inclusion. And so that is something that should give us hope that we'll be able to achieve something really meaningful and valuable and useful in the relatively short term, because we have to.
Carol, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I echo everything that Shauna would say. I would say, really, I think, Richard was talking about his biggest fear being we're going to miss the moment. And I would echo that. And I think across some of the biggest imperatives we have as a country in terms of what a recovery looks like, in terms of the kind of country we're trying to shape after, one that is greener, one that is more equitable and inclusive, one where we are more prosperous, it isn't going to happen without, to the extent that it can, we'll be eating around the edges of it, without really fundamentally leveraging the strength of our cities and learning from the experiences that we've had over the course of the pandemic, that to get things done quickly and efficiently, it means needing to work together in new ways. And maybe to try to channel a bit of Shauna's hope and optimism, because I've got to believe it, we're working very hard toward it. I think what's fundamentally different about this time is that we are seeing, and we came very close to a real collapse because of the limits of our system when the pandemic first hit. Cities were driven to the financial brink, which would have meant cutting really essential frontline services that Canadians relied on. And we realized as a country, we can't do that. And so the federal government stepped forward. It put some money through the Safe Restart agreements to flow through to the provinces, to the cities, because we knew we simply cannot do that. We needed the cities to be responsive on the front lines and to be able to continue keeping Canadians safe and supporting our most vulnerable. And I think even if it has to come from a place of emergency, from a place of urgency like that, we really be foolish as a country to not be learning these lessons and trying to really forecast what that means for for the necessity of greater ambition for us collectively going forward. And so in part, that's, whoever asked that question, it's an excellent question. Ask it everywhere you go, because in part, it's going to take that kind of pressure. And I think there is more awareness, and I'm hopeful that we're going to really be able to have more traction than we have had on this kind of a conversation.
Anita, you wanted to get in there?
Yeah, I want to bring in the perspective of the private sector and point to a really hard problem that I think could be a place where innovation could happen if we can get that right. And I'm very interested in what you think, Richard. I'm very interested in what you think, Shauna and Carol, about this problem. So I see many of our core systems in cities, the financial services system, the healthcare system, the way that we deliver energy, as very much aligned with industrial era ideas. Many of these systems developed during World War II. They emerged in systems of hierarchy. They've been managed over the past decade intensively for efficiency. They haven't been inclusive. They're designed at scale. They pursue scale, and the boundary on scale leaves out many of these disenfranchised people at the fringes of the cities that we've alluded to and described already. The challenge for us, especially as we think about redeploying the real estate at the city core, the places of work that Richard described, is to work with the owners of that capital to try to redeploy the resources in those downtown core and in our communities in ways that are aligned with a new set of ideas about what prosperity is. This is what Carol was describing a little bit earlier. Those things are not going to involve eating more Doritos or selling more junk or, driving more efficiency. I am nothing against Doritos, but we have to think about a new model for encouraging private sector investment that is not based on an industrial, hierarchical, decentralized, scale-oriented approach. That's built much more on collaboration, that's more sharing economy oriented, that's oriented toward creating great experiences, and that really deeply engages in a nuanced and multifaceted way the ways in which people at the fringe are connected to people who are at the core of the city, okay? And enriches those relationships and makes those relationships more prosperous on both sides, okay? So that challenge is a big challenge for city leadership, which is when I say city leadership, I don't even only mean public sector. I mean private sector leaders, people who are left holding a lot of real estate in the city core that's rapidly diminishing in value. Look at Sidewalk Labs and the narrative about that. How do we, as public and private citizens with public and private interests, get a lot more creative about creating prosperity for everybody in our community and not just for a few enfranchised people that have traditionally held the reins on industrial capitalism.
Richard, I'll let you jump in just really quickly if you have a remark. We only have about 7 minutes left, and I did want to get to one more question, but just because Anita did give you a shout out in the
end. I think Anita has nailed something really important there for the Canadian context, in that even in my own work with the New Urban Project, we talked about distributing power more evenly, or devolving power from the provinces to the local level, but in terms of government. And Anita, when you were saying that, I thought about almost every successful city revitalization effort I've seen in the past 20 years came from something called a public-private partnership. And basically private and public sector actors working together with limited resources said, we're gonna rebuild our city anyway, regardless. And I mean, in the United States, in the past 4 years, that has had to be done because there was a Trump administration and you could get no help, you would just get hurt. And many of those cities are in red states where the state government is trying to preempt them and do horrendous things to them. But I do think maybe instead of just focusing on the devolution of power across governments, that Anita, you've identified something very powerful, that with great businesses an incredible private sector, large scale real estate assets, big banks, and great utility, I mean, go on, media companies, that one of the things we could do a little better is these public-private partnerships. I know we at the University of Toronto with the School of Cities, we're all involved in it. The University of Toronto has become much more involved in civic affairs, but until the University of Toronto did that, Canadian universities didn't do it very well at all. In the US, these are called anchor institutions. They become very much involved in dealing with the anchor institutions in Philadelphia. Penn, Drexel, Jefferson rebuilt the anchor institutions in Newark, the Newark Institute, New Jersey Institute of Technology, Rutgers Newark, and the Prudential Corporation rebuilt Newark when the city was completely broken. Not to say we're going to do that in Canada, not to say we should do that, but to say that we can do more of that. And I think your idea of activating this in a more civically minded way, in a more inclusive way, yeah, that's something that's really low hanging fruit. And it doesn't require something on the order of a new constitution to do.
I think it's kind of like a new public-private deal, right? Where you get the buy-in from both the public sector and the private sector that working together actually is additive. It brings greater benefits than constantly being at odds or trying to extract value or goods or capital that simply is actually going to make things worse rather than better off.
All right, my last question for the panel, and whoever wants it first can sort of glom onto it. But whenever we're talking about making cities more affordable or more inclusive, inevitably you're always going to get naysayers or a chorus of negative Nellies, if you will, basically saying that one of the hallmarks of a world-class city is unaffordability, and they'll point to cities like London, New York, Paris, et cetera, to suggest that there's just no way we can ever make cities affordable for regular folk. How do we kill that talking point with fire?
With public investment and public action and intention. I think we can't kill it just with words, right? We actually need to do something. We need to show that it's possible for cities to create affordable housing in the core and in desirable neighborhoods and in 15-minute cities that are actually accessible and equitable and diverse. And we need to do it by showing how to do it, by modeling it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Is that all right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll agree with Sean there. And I was going to give a very similar example that we've really got to start taking our immediate action, the places we know we are already going to be acting and modeling this kind of behavior. And I think affordable housing is an excellent example of that. Also, to the earlier conversation, excellent example of where we've got to do better in terms of collaboration with the private sector. And I think it also sort of behooves us to then sort of really take a comprehensive approach to this, understanding the other costs in Canadians' lives, looking at this all through a lens of how does that couple with access to transit and affordable transportation options? How are we doing the kind of thing that Anita described and really sort of looking at the people who are living a bit further away from the densest parts of our cities and how are we connecting those dots? And so I really think it just starts by doing it. And even if it's a small bite at first, I think really public action and public investment is critical to start dismantling that narrative. And it's a sticky one.
Anita, really quickly.
Yeah, I just, I think we need to rethink even what public-private partnerships can be, and enrich that and expand that. And since I may be the last panelist, I do also just want to thank you so much, Supriya, for being with us and for being such a great leader of the conversation. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
You're here.
Oh my gosh, get out of here, I'll yell. Actually, we do have like a minute left. So Richard, I saw you nodding vigorously once again. I'll let you get the last word.
No, I think that housing affordability problem in Canada is a big one. I'm always shocked at how unaffordable housing is in Toronto and Vancouver. I mean, shocked, and even compared to the New York Metro. I mean, the Toronto Metro, a metro, not city, not Manhattan, the downtown Toronto, is probably 3 to 4 times more expensive than the New York Metro. I mean, that's a lot of money. Maybe part of it is not just building more in the metro, it's building more. Jane Jacobs, one of the last things she said to me, she said, when you look at the US, Richard, there's all these kinds of big and small and medium-sized cities. In Canada, there's really only 2 or 3. And she was just being funny, right? She was being Jane. Maybe we should be focused a little bit more on building up other great places. I think we got to take the pressure. We have, what is it? 20% of our population and more of our economy in the GTA. It's as big as like New York, San Francisco, LA, DC, and
Yeah.
Boston combined. Maybe that's something for us to think about long run, that we can build up some other great places in our country.
Well, with that, I think we have to leave it. Thank you so much, obviously, to the panelists. Thank you to the organizers. And of course, thank you to everyone who tuned in. All right, have a great rest of your day.